how pain is modified or suppressed in the body, right? So I'll just go back a few slides. We have seen that pain modification or pain suppressing system, there are two levels. One level acting from the brain and the higher centers, and one level which is from the spinal cord itself. So supraspinal network and spinal network. We have seen that there are a specific group of chemicals called endorphins which act on opioid receptors and reduce the sensation of pain. The same group of chemicals are also responsible for producing a sensation of pleasure in our body. Now you have seen this descending network from all the higher centers in the brain, limbic structures. Limbic structure, what are those structures? A system of nuclei and neural networks responsible for emotions, right? So from all these higher structures, periaqueductal grey matter, right? So this is at the level of the midbrain. So this is where the stimulation happens. From here we have a descending network. So this in turn, neurons arising from here in turn come downwards into the brain stem, and here they activate two systems. One catecholaminergic system. So this systems arise from two nuclei, RVLM and locus coeruleus. Both these two nuclei in turn, the neurons arising from this nuclei come down to the spinal cord and activate one interneuron in between. So this is a interneuron which secretes enkephalin. So catecholamine ke liye there are two systems or networks. One from RVLM. So RVLM we have learnt in blood pressure also, same nucleus, and the second one is locus coeruleus. The second set of neural network that is also activated by the same descending neurons is the raphe magnus, nucleus raphe magnus. Neurons arising from nucleus raphe magnus also descend downwards and secrete serotonin. So this one, right? So they also activate the interneurons. So interneurons, this neuron which you see here, enkephalin secreting interneuron is an inhibitory interneuron, and this interneuron can cause both presynaptic and postsynaptic inhibition, right? So this is the primary pain pathway. ये first order neuron है, it is secreting substance P or glutamate. We have seen in the fast and slow pain pathways. This is the second order neuron in the spinal cord. So ये जो synapse है, it can cause presynaptic as well as postsynaptic inhibition. So descending pain pathways mean the pain inhibiting or pain suppressing or analgesic pathways. So in your exam, if you get a question on descending pain pathways, it would imply discussion on the pain inhibiting or endogenous analgesic pathways, right? Pain carrying pathways, remember, is an ascending pathway. Okay. One more group of chemicals recently identified was cannabinoids. So just like cannabis, right? You have heard about cannabis, addictive substance. So chemically similar, structurally similar chemicals identified in the brain, they are called as endogenous cannabinoids. So they also can cause some sort of pain suppression. Okay. Next one is the gate control theory. So this pain inhibiting system is in the spinal cord level itself. The most common example of this pathway or this process in work is whenever you get injured somewhere, our reflex tendency we try to rub that part or hold that part firmly. So whenever we are rubbing a part or pressing a part, we are stimulating mechanoreceptors or tactile receptors. Tactile receptors are carried by A beta pathways, touch receptors. A beta is a faster pathway, right? So what happens when you are stimulating here, it goes to the dorsal horn, and as it comes down to the, this is the dorsal root ganglia. So this signals as they reach the dorsal horn, what happens? This in turn stimulates an inhibitory pathway. So this is the inhibitory interneuron that you see here. Interneuron which secretes enkephalin or GABA. So again one inhibitory interneuron which gets activated. So question may arise कि उस जगह जिस जगह से पेन जा रहा है, why is it not being activated by this, right? Because you can see the pain carrying pathways which are shown in red, they also give these branches, right? तो same area से अगर दोनों sensations जा रहे हैं, pain was the initial thing response में हमने उस part को दबा के रखा है ऐसे. We started rubbing that part. But remember, pain pathways are slower, and this is faster. So in any case, these signals will reach faster and activate this nucleus fast, this particular cell. So which in turn inhibits the pain transmission further. So it is like a gate. So that's why the name is gate control theory. This theory is also used in different forms of therapies, like reduction of pain using some electrical stimulation. Afterwards, so the fresh topic for today is we'll talk about referred pain. So examples of referred pain you have already read in different parts, right? You have read about the pain of myocardial ischemia being referred to which part? Myocardial infarction का जो pain है that is referred to left forearm, left arm, sometimes even to the jaw, and occasionally to the right side and even to the back. Epigastrium is also one more side. So this is one. Ureteric pain. Ureter, these are pathway structures which convey urine from the kidneys to the bladder. So ureteric pain is referred to the testicle of the particular side, right? Ureteric pain can happen when you have a stone or a calculus impacted in the ureter. The third example that you see here is appendicitis, a pain of acute appendicitis. Initially, the pain is referred to the periumbilical region. So this is an example of a radiating pain. Now, after a few hours, you also feel pain at the place where appendix is present, that is in the right iliac fossa. But that pain, the cause is different. So that is because of irritation of the parietal peritoneum, which has a lot of sensory nerve endings, right? But initial response to that pain, that is in the periumbilical region. So this is an example of a referred pain. Pain of acute cholecystitis, gallbladder infection. So that is referred to the back, right? Tip of the right shoulder or right scapula, right? So these are examples where the source of pain is somewhere else and the pain is experienced in somewhere else. If you observe carefully, also one more thing that will come across is these are all different types of visceral organs. These are not somatic structures. The visceral organs, the pain is often referred to the somatic structure, and the brain fails to interpret that the pain is not coming from the somatic structure but is actually source is somewhere else. So this is where the brain fails to identify. This type of pain is called as a referred pain. So one example, important point here is that it is at a remote structure, right? Radiating pain के साथ इसका difference ये है कि radiating pain spreads to a distant side, right, along an anatomical train, right? So there is a continuity spreading across a continuous pathway or a train, whereas in referred pain, बीच का there is no anatomical spreading or continuity. So this is the difference between referred and the radiating pain. Now what are the reasons? How do we explain this phenomena? So there are two main theories which try to explain. The first theory is convergence projection theory, and the second one is facilitation theory. Convergence projection theory, what does it say? It says that visceral and somatic afferents, sensory nerves coming from a visceral organ and the somatic structure like a muscle or a skin belonging to the same spinal segment, right? They converge on the same second order neuron. So you can see an example here. So from a same spinal segment, the one you see in pink color or purple color, so that is for fiber which carries pain from a visceral organ, right? The one shown in green carrying the afferent fibers from a somatic structure. So they are converging on the same second order neuron, right? So convergence, this is the convergence part. Now brain cannot determine, as I said, whether the stimulus came from the viscera or from the somatic area where it was felt. तो उसी spinal segment का जो somatic structure है, the brain projects the pain to be coming from that somatic structure. So this is called as convergence projection theory. It is similar to crossed telephone connections, right? Okay. So to understand this, I hope you have already read about this part also, this dermatomal map. So embryonic development may, initially the developing embryo has a lot of segments called as somites, right? So from each of the somites, several structures develop, somatic structures. Now each part is supplied by as given somatic nerve, cutaneous nerve. So that part of the skin is called as a dermatome. So it is a part of the skin or area of the skin which is supplied by a single nerve root, right? Embryologically उसी segment से जो भी visceral structures develop हुए होंगे, so they will all have this tendency of projection, right? Say the cardiac example that we gave. So all these structures for that matter, developmentally they are from the same embryonic segments, right? So that is why it is referred to the skin which has the similar supply, dermatomal map, right? So this is the basis of this. Second theory is the facilitation theory. Facilitation theory states what? Any visceral sensory traffic facilitates some adjacent synapses relaying somatic sensations in the spinal segment. So again, so this purple colored one is a visceral afferent. So visceral किसी fiber में, when there is a continuous or a prolonged activity. So say if you talk of say acute appendicitis, it is an inflammation which is happening. So it is a prolonged thing, right? Cholecystitis, infection develop of it starts, there is an inflammatory response, there is some inflammatory swelling, exudation, all of this. Whenever this type of prolonged things happen, right, visceral afference of what is happening, so it is causing some type of facilitation to the neurons surrounding the particular neuron. The facilitation, you recall, we talked about the property of facilitation in the properties of synapses. कि अगर वो किसी और न्यूरॉन को किसी तरीके से enhance करे activity, that is called as facilitation. So facilitation can also happen pre and post synaptically. So this neuron, what is it is doing? This branch is facilitating transmission across this particular synapse. This green colored afferent is coming from a somatic structure. तो somatic structure से जो segmental neuron तक वो synapse है, this is getting enhanced or facilitated. So this is again creating confusion in the brain. So brain feels like the pain is coming from that particular dermatome, not from the visceral organ, but from that area of the skin. So somatic sensations from the corresponding dermatome are consequently perceived to be of greater intensity. तो अगर कोई एक्टिविटी स्किन में वाकई में है, so that is enhanced. And see, suppose if there is no activity, if it is a sub-threshold level activity, so that becomes a threshold level now because of facilitation, and it causes again one type of referred pain. So these are the two main theories that explain the basis of referred pain. So in your books and all you will find several other theories, but those theories are obsolete, right? Main two theories which explain referred pain are this: convergence projection and facilitation. So these are two important, again a very important question. So pain as such is a very important question. Next one, right? So if you are asked, if you get a long question on pain, so that should cover the transmission. Transmission में what comes? Neospinothalamic tract and paliospinothalamic tract, जो कि pain लेके जा रहा है brain तक, right? Second aspect, even if you are not asked in the question, you should mention about descending pain, that is the pain modulating pathways, inhibiting pathways, right? So we have talked about those. You should talk about the gate control theory and then referred pain, right? So pain का एक broad question आता है, you should touch about all of these aspects. Next we will move on to the motor system of the body, right? So what we learned in today's remaining time, we will talk about the structures and the levels of the motor system. We will talk about the types of movements that are there. We will outline the hierarchical control of motor activity, and if time permits we will talk about the muscle spindle. So these are our learning objectives. Now what are the different examples of motor activities in our day-to-day life, right? So you can see various examples here, right? These are not just examples, they also show varying degrees of complexity of motor activities, right? First two examples. So if you touch across a hot iron or a hot substance, for example, or say you get stuck by a sharp pricking object on your foot, what is the immediate response? Of course you feel pain, right? Then the immediate response is there is a movement, right? If you touch something hot, you immediately remove your hand, often without making any conscious thought in this. There is a reflex. So this is one type of motor activity. If you get stuck here, you will sit down, then you will withdraw. Withdrawal is the first response, then you will try to remove the stimulus. So here, reflex ke saath there is some type of thought which has gone into this, and thought ke baad you have the action. Second examples that you also see is motor activity also talks about balance, maintaining balance in the body, posture of the body. So this example actually gives a very beautiful illustration, in the sense that for all movements, we don't realize this much, but for every movement that we do, the body needs to be in a certain posture before the start of the movement. So judo, karate and all of these are examples that helps you to appreciate this. Think for example those who are into trekking and all. So trekking mein, the movements are very simple. You keep on walking, you put a stick and then keep on walking. But at every moment, the posture of the body is equally important, right? Climbing a tree, for example. So grasping movements are there, but posture hona chahiye proper. So posture or maintenance is also a facet of motor activity. Maintaining of erect posture, balance for that matter is a motor activity. Balance is actually a very coordinated and integrated thing. Sensations bhi chahiye uske liye, and motor activities, of course, it's there. Okay. So these two examples you see, walking is what? We may think of that we have to go there, right? But exactly at that moment, we are not actually thinking, right? We have to flex the knee joint, then flex the hip joint, knee joint, and then extend. But the point to point joints mein movement, we are not thinking and doing. So this is an example of a stereotyped movement. We are thinking, kahan tak soch rahe ki hame chal ke jana hai udhar, right? So that is a thought that needs to be executed. But as I said, there are movements like this. Chewing, for example, is also a movement. You know when to start to chew, but movements, temporomandibular joint where movements were not actually thinking and doing. So examples are stereotyped movements where initiation mein there is some thought involved, but the execution part goes on in a repeated and a known pattern. So this is an best example of this, right? And the remaining two examples that you see, this need a lot of what? Is it different or is it at the same level? Moment to moment basis where you see so many things need to be calculated, right? What is the distance, angle kis angle se aa raha hai, what is the speed with which it is coming, right? And accordingly, at every moment the execution needs to be modified. Kaun se direction mein I have to hit, with what force should I hit, right? And where should I stop, right? Immediately फिर से दोबारा से आएगा ball. So a very fine precise movement involving a lot of motor calculation and music, of course. So if you play, the musicians, the movements here are one of the most precise movements of the body. And later on in some class we'll see that musicians actually have there is a area, trained or expert musicians, they have certain areas of the brain which actually become larger, right? So we'll talk about this in some other class. But these are various facets of motor activity, something very simple as this to something very complex as these two examples, and somewhere in between you have intermediate degrees of complexity, balance, maintenance, walking and posture, right? So these are different things you have to learn about. All of these things, how are they maintained in the body. Before I go further, some basic principles of CNS circuitry. See, sensory system mein we talked about some circuits, right? Ki wo receptors se first order, second order, third order, and then to the cortex. Cortex mein we talked about some circuits. Here in motor system, circuits are very much more obvious and very much more critical. So you should just understand ki what are the basic principles of CNS circuits. One thing that you have appreciated till now is a neuron never works alone. So neuron will always work together in a synaptically connected network. So this type of networks are called as circuits, right? Some circuits are sensory, some are motor. Most circuits that are there in the body, they are having features of both, that is sensory as well as motor. So that is what first idea that should impress upon your mind is, see, motor activities also, we might think it is independent, but it is not so. Voluntary motor activities, it is mostly in response to a stimulus or a sensation. So sensory and motor activities, functionally they are very related to each other, right? So there are some local circuits. For examples, spinal cord maybe there are some circuits. The reflex arcs, for example, stretch reflex, withdrawal reflex. Similarly, in the brain also there are some circuits, right? So from the lowest level to the highest level, circuits are present. And highest level may you also see some additional things. There are some pathways. So descending pathways, the descending tracks, or ascending pathways, sensory pathways. And generally there is a to and fro connection between these pathways and the other regions of the brain. So these circuits, they can be activated when there is a sensation, some type of stimulus. So stimulus के according वो react कर सकते हैं. This is one. But these circuits also have the property of pacemaker cells. That is, pacemaker का मतलब ये है कि it can generate its own activity. You have learned about the pacemaker activity in heart, right? You have also learned that there are pacemaker cells in the respiratory system, in the brainstem, which is generating rhythmic inspiratory signals, right? You don't think about producing inspiration every now and then. Subconsciously भी चलता रहता है. So there is a pacemaker cell in the brainstem. Similar pacemaker cells are also present in the GI tract, right? Which is periodically producing this peristaltic movements. So similar pacemaker cells in the CNS, they are called as central pattern generators, right? Pattern generators. So you see the name itself tells. The examples कौन से होने चाहिए इसके लिए? Walking, right? Running, breathing, chewing, and sometimes even playing instruments, right? So you have seen that these are all different types of stereotypical movements, and so you can see they are regulated by some pattern producing pacemaker circuits. We call them as pattern generators. And spinal cord में ये जिस तरीके के CPGs present है, we call them as locomotor pattern generators. Okay? So this type of generators are present. Why? So because there are a lot of you can see these activities. In सारे activities के लिए precise timing is important, precise movements are important, and generally so there is a rhythmic temporal pattern. What does this mean? कि time में एक ही जैसा एक pattern of movements are happening, right? So if we have a pattern generator that keeps our brain free from thinking about something else. If these pattern generators were not present, the brain would have to consciously think of every movement that you do and then accordingly execute. तो सोचने के लिए और time नहीं है, right? So this is a reason, evolutionary reason. So cortical development में cortex का क्या role है? Cortex helps us that a lot of thinking related intellectual functions, right? Movement भी है उसमें. But for all those things, the brain should be free. So this is possible by a lot of things which keeps the brain free from undue stress. One of the reasons or mechanisms is this. Spinal cord level में there are some pattern generators. Day to day life में या जो ज़्यादा movements हो रहे हैं body में, so those are governed by pattern generators, right? Of course, they can be influenced by the brain, right? But even if there is no influence of the brain, they can still function. Local circuits receive multiple inputs and they have various outputs. So dorsal horn of the spinal cord receives a lot of inputs, right? So inputs, you see this diagram. So they are receiving inputs. This is the dorsal horn. So neurons here are receiving inputs from the sensory neurons, first order neurons. They are also receiving inputs from the upper motor neurons. Brain से जो signal लेके spinal cord तक पहुँच रहे हैं. So they are also receiving some type of signals. And they are also receiving inputs from the interneurons, right? तो पेन में ही हम लोगों ने देखा कि पेन पाथवे को there is a descending system which inhibits pain, right? So all these type of circuits they can receive a lot of inputs, various types of inputs. Thalamic relay neurons to the cortex. So cortex में भी जो इस तरीके के inputs हैं, there are various types of inputs which are present. Output cells of the circuits are called as projection neurons or projection cells. Why projection? Because they send their axons to different targets, one or more targets. Alpha motor neuron in the spinal cord sends its neurons to the muscles, right? And junctions that we have is the neuromuscular junction. Similarly, अगर आप brain में सोचें, so descending tract from the spinal in the spinal cord, so they arise in the brain, pyramidal cells in the cerebral cortex, arising from there, and the output is to the spinal cord, descending tracts. Thalamocortical loops, cerebellocortical loops. तो cerebellum और cortex के बीच में, thalamus और cortex के बीच में there are circuits. तो ऐसा नहीं है कि all projections from the cortex come down to the spinal cord. Some are also going to other areas of the brain like the thalamus and the cerebellum. All of them have important functions. And the next important property is interneurons. So what is that? So interneurons are present in between, right? You can see this. So for diagrammatic sake, this is a very simplified illustration. कि एक ही interneuron में इधर दिखाया है. This is a sensory, this is a motor neuron. In between, the blue one is a interneuron. But in actual practice in the body, there are millions of such neurons in each segment of the spinal cord. To the extent that you see, the interneurons are 30 times more numerous than the other neurons, more alpha motor neurons and the dorsal neurons. So you can understand the importance of this. Interneurons में जो circuits हैं, they can be all different types. Diverging circuits, converging circuits, and repetitive discharge circuits. We call them as reverberating circuits. So types of synaptic circuits also, try to look upon the previous lectures. We have talked about the different types of synaptic circuits. So spinal cord में you have all of these different types of synaptic circuits which are possible. So this is just to say that interneurons play a very vital role in integrating activities, right? Sensory, motor, सब कुछ, integrating various signals within the motor system itself, so that our final output is smooth, right? A very important role played by this. Interneurons can also be present not only in the spinal cord. So one example that you see here is cerebellum. So cerebellum का जब class होगा, you will see the granule cells. You have numerous millions of cells in the cerebellum. So granule cells are interneurons, and the granule cells are actually more in number than either the input neurons of the cerebellum or the output neurons. Such is the importance of interneurons in CNS. Okay, so what do you see here? Also an example of interneuron. So this basic circuit is also called as a circuit for a stretch reflex. We'll try to discuss towards the end of this class. So ventral horn mein there are various types of neurons. Alpha motor neuron, and the second type of neuron is a gamma motor neuron. So dorsal horn mein jo neurons hai, they are sensory. Ventral horn mein jo neurons hai, they are motor. And there are two types, alpha and gamma. Okay. So this is a diagram of the different layers of cerebral cortex. So important points that you see here is inputs. I was talking about inputs. Thalamus say most of the inputs are going to layer number 2 and 3, right? And outputs, if you see, some outputs are going to outside the cerebral cortex. So descending inputs, you see this is a neuron which is arising from layer number 5, the pyramidal cell. So basic जो voluntary movements के लिए जो signals हैं, they start from here, pyramidal cells, and they are executed by this type of neurons which come down from the cortex, they descend down to the spinal cord and reach the different spinal segments. You also see some other projections to subcortical structures like the thalamus. Now after this, we move on to the different structures that are involved in executing or bringing about movements in our day-to-day lives, and what are the levels that are there, right? So cerebral cortex we all understand कि motor cortex बहुत important part है, जैसे sensory cortex है वैसे ही pre-central gyrus में you have a motor cortex from where signals are executed. So you remember the word I used, the word execution of signals. So this is what you see, execution from here it comes down to the spinal cord. Spinal cord में कौन से level तक? So this is, suppose you want to do a movement of the upper limb, you want to ride, you want to hold a glass of water, you want to lift a bucket of water. So all this type of movements are happening from the upper limb. Upper limb का जो motor supply, this is governed from which plexus? Brachial plexus. यानी कि lower cervical segments and the first thoracic segments. So depending on the part of the body that I am trying to move, so उस segment तक this signals will go. So there are descending projections like this to all the segments of the spinal cord. Whichever movement I want to make, that particular signal will reach to that particular spinal segment. उसी segment तक पहुँचेगा. Next you have some other structures. Cortex के ठीक नीचे you have thalamus, you have basal ganglia. Now what is basal ganglia? Basal ganglia, you will also read about this network of basal nuclei in anatomy. A collection or cluster of nuclei below the level of the cerebral cortex, right? Deep within the brain, ventral surface of the brain, you have collection of different nuclei which helps us to bring about automatic movements, right? Automatic movements kaise? Suppose when you are walking, your arms are swinging on the sides even if you are not making any conscious effort. So automatic movements like this, movements को actually कराना है या नहीं, that particular facet of action, right? Plan when everything is ready, but actually should it happen or not? And also maintenance of tone and posture. So this is all governed from basal ganglia. So basal ganglia का जो loop है, you will see the projections are actually, there is a loop between the cortex and the basal ganglia. So this, उसके effects भी, it is coming eventually through this. Next level पे you have the brain stem. Brain stem में we have different types of nuclei like the reticular nucleus, right, vestibular nucleus, from where you can see descending projections again coming down to the neurons, ventral neurons of the spinal cord, right. So this is one set of activities. So there are descending tracks. Posture maintenance में, tone maintenance में, this has got a very vital role. Brain stem, right. Cerebellum का क्या role है? Cerebellum has got 2-3 very important roles. Any type of complex activity, like writing is a very complex activity. So many muscles and joints are involved. Speaking is a very complex activity. Speaking के लिए the movements start from the diaphragm because vocalization or phonation happens in the phase of expiration only. So diaphragm पहले move करता है, that produces vibrations in the vocal folds. That vibration in vocal folds is a broad spectrum thing. बहुत सारे frequencies है, right? So that sound as it comes out through the mouth. So for every letter that we speak, उस point of time पे, उस instant of time पे, the configuration of the articulators like the lips, the tongue, the palate, all of this change. So there is a filtering effect. So you can think about it कि दिन भर में हम लोग कितना बोलते हैं, right? And so much of motor activities, precise motor activities are doing. So movement to movement, joint to joint जो ये smoothening है, so that is done by the cerebellum. If cerebellum is affected, the speech becomes scanned. That means all motor functions can be done, but they are broken down into the individual movements. एक बार में smoothly नहीं होगा movement. Cerebellum का दूसरा function है coordination of activities, right? Fine movements, precise movements के लिए coordination is very important. Error correction एक और important aspect है. As I touched upon this in the previous lecture, कि brain में कुछ areas हैं, they are just right areas concerned with thought. So I told you about this in the last class. All activities arise from a thought. That's why the saying, तुमको देखा तो ये ख्याल आया. Told this specific line So everything starts with a thought. There are areas in the brain which are concerned with thought. Thought is conveyed to a planning area. So thoughts, पहले का idea of the response or idea of the movement or thought of the movement goes to an area for planning. The supplementary motor and the pre-motor areas concerned with planning. Planning में algorithm बनता है पूरा कि कौन सा joint पहले move करेगा. In that particular joint, what should be the movement, flexion or extension, right? You think about all of this. Flexion में how much should be the force? Very strong flexion is needed, moderate degree of flexion is needed, right? And उसी same point of time पे उस joint पे जो antagonist muscle है, if I have to flex the elbow, the triceps should relax. Otherwise, flexion will not happen. They will balance each other, right? So this is also happening. So all this type of planning is happening in the planning area. Once the plan is made, this plan, उसके 2-3 copies बनते हैं. One copy goes to the motor cortex, primary motor cortex for execution, right? So that will come down to the spinal cord and execution will happen. Second copy goes to the cerebellum, right? Third copy goes to a nucleus called the red nucleus. Cerebellum में now you have the copies there. Spinocerebellar tracts. Recall the tracts we talked in the last lecture. Spinocerebellar tract से feedback आता है. So one, spinal cord में कितना correctly पहुंचा information, that is taken by the anterior or ventral spinocerebellar tract. This is the first level of feedback. कि जो plan था वो as it is spinal cord तक पहुंचा कि नहीं. If not, cerebellum में feedback और motor plan के बीच में there is a mismatch, there is a correction. Similarly, execution होने के बाद from the muscle spindle again to the proprioceptors, posterior spinocerebellar tract say this feedback goes again to the cerebellum. So again it compares कि original plan or feedback, is it same or is there a mismatch? अगर दोबारा से there is a mismatch, it will correct it. So cerebellum is a very vital, very vital structure, right? Then spinal cord, next level. Spinal cord में you have different integration of all the neurons, right? Dorsal, ventral and interneurons. Interneurons, we have talked about this, they can be excitatory, inhibitory, and in the neuron जो pool है, it's not a single neuron, remember, it's a pool of neurons at every level of the spinal cord. They can be all types of synaptic circuits, diverging, converging, etc. They can be excitatory and inhibitory. So this is all happening at the level of the spinal cord. Muscles are the final effector organs to bring out any form of motor activity. The movement or locomotion, what is the difference? Is it the same? What is the difference between movement and locomotion? So in locomotion you have what? Displacement, right? Okay, so this is the structural level कि motor apparatus में कौन से structures आते हैं, उनके क्या functions है broadly. Now functionally if I think कि कौन से कितने levels हैं, the first level is the pre-command level. And you see, I have placed it here. So actually, basal ganglia cerebellum, right, and association cortex. Cortex में scattered association areas of the brain. Association area से निकलता है plan, the idea of the thought. Then command is being generated. So this is planning area. So structurally this is, you can see, cortex के थोड़ा नीचे है. This is the, but functionally this is an important starting point. Command, pre-command level. Pre-command के बाद next level is projection level. The cerebral cortex, descending tract is the projection level, right? All of this. The third level is the segmental level, the spinal cord, right? Where all the descending influences are merging eventually. So motor activity, it depends on the spinal motor neurons, as we have seen. Spinal motor neurons can be both alpha and gamma, right? Alpha 1 is the neuron which brings about voluntary activity, right? This is also called as the final common pathway. All type of descending influences, eventually they will reach on the alpha motor neuron. Gamma motor neuron का function है more subtle and involuntary, like maintenance of muscle tone and muscle posture, body posture, This is the function of the gamma motor neuron. Okay. Now spinal motor neurons, for movements below the level of the neck and throughout the body, we have the spinal nerves. Analogous to this, for movements in the face and head region, will be the cranial nerves, right? So cranial nerves are the lower motor neurons for movements in the head and face. Clear है? So ventral horn cell में जो nucleus है, the nucleus of the alpha motor neuron. Cranial nerve के origin के जो nucleus है, these are all in the brain stem. तो ये analogous structures है, you have to understand this. Scheme of control दोनों का एक है, but the levels are different. So from the cortex, descending influences bombard the spinal neurons and other neurons. So these are the upper motor neurons. Look at this schematic diagram. We have mostly talked about all the structures. इस diagram में just try to identify the upper and lower motor neurons. Spinal cord से नीचे muscle तक जो जा रहा है, that is the lower motor neuron, right? Because it is the final step, so that is why the word lower has been used. Lower motor neuron. Similarly, as I said, for the muscles of the face, the head and neck, इस region के जो muscles है, right? For them, the lower motor neurons are the cranial nerves, and they will not arise from the spinal cord, right? Cranial nerves कहाँ से arise करते हैं? They arise from the different levels of the brain stem, midbrain, pons and medulla. They have different nuclei. You will read about this in anatomy also. So they arise from the brain stem, not the spinal cord. But appreciate this, that they are analogous. Lower motor neurons ही है. So they are under the control of higher centers. तो cortex से जो voluntary movement के लिए आ रहा है, that is the corticospinal tract. You see the name, cortex से spinal cord तक, corticospinal tract, descending tract directly coming to the spinal cord. Similarly, brain stem में जो cranial nerves निकल रहे हैं, for them you have the analogous corticobulbar projection, right? It is analogous to the corticospinal, but the name is corticobulbar. Why? Because medulla is often described as the bulb of the brain. That's why the name corticobulbar. So it is, these two tracts are functionally analogous. One coming to the spinal cord and one to the brain stem. ब्रेन स्टेम से दूसरा और क्या निकलता है? ब्रेन स्टेम में जो डिफरेंट न्यूक्लिया है, दे ऑल्सो गिव राइज टू द वेरियस एक्स्ट्रा पिरामिडल ट्रैक्ट्स. सो दे ऑल्सो कम डाउन टू द स्पाइनल कॉर्ड. वेस्टिबुलर न्यूक्लियस से वेस्टिबुलर स्पाइनल ट्रैक्ट, रेटिकुलर न्यूक्लियस से रेटिकुलर स्पाइनल ट्रैक्ट. सो ऑल ऑफ दिस, तो इनका फंक्शन है मेंटेनेंस ऑफ टोन, पॉस्चर एंड कंट्रोल ऑफ द मसल्स अराउंड द मिड लाइन ऑफ द बॉडी. Proximal muscles का जो movement है, that is mostly regulated by this particular tracts. Why the name extrapyramidal tract? नाम ऐसा क्यों? Because corticospinal tract, as it comes down, it produces a bulge in the brain stem similar to a pyramid. तो corticospinal tract को often it is referred to as the pyramidal tract. तो corticospinal tract छोड़ के बाकी जितने tracts हैं, these are called as extrapyramidal tracts. You also see here the other functional components. We talked about the basal ganglia, thalamus. You देखो basal ganglia, thalamus का there is a different circuit going on here. Similarly, cerebellum it can reach the cortex, corticocerebellar projections, and it can also directly influence the spinal cord through the brain stem. So this is the general scheme of activities of the motor system. Types of movements that are there, right? Examples we have already talked. There are three broad types of movement: reflex movement, stereotyped movements, and self-expressive or goal-directed movements. So broadly, if you compare, what do you find? Reflex and stereotyped movements are mostly unconscious. We are walking, but we are not consciously making the movements in the hip joint and knee joint at every point of time. Right? So unconscious. Reflex movements purpose, it is generally protective mostly. So examples, touching a hot plate. Stereotype movements में these are mostly behavioral type movements like walking, chewing, breathing, etc. Behavioral patterns of movements. जहाँ पे pattern आ जाता है, you have stereotyped movements. circuits are mostly within the spinal cord, central pattern generators. Self-expressive or goal-directed movements, so they are conscious, right? And उनका purpose क्या है? Whatever action consciously आप चाह रहे हो करना, that has to come from this. So example is putting a ball in a basket, writing, all of this comes through this. Broad type or categories of movements are these three, right? Now let us see the hierarchical control of motor system. So we have seen cerebral cortex में there are different areas. In the previous flow charts we have seen the cortical motor central, it is the highest center of activities, right? It includes both thought का area भी इधर ही है, right? Planning का area भी cortex में है, execution का area भी cortex में. So this is all present here. Brainstem's motor control center, the different motor nuclei, this is the second level of control or in the hierarchy. Third, spinal cord में you have central pattern generators, right? Repetitive pattern discharge के लिए, and you have interneuron pull. So remember interneuron का जो ये, like it is one step ahead because of its complexities. Interneuron pull, as I said previously also, that it has got diverging, converging, all type of circuits. It can be both inhibitory and excitatory. So ये एक level ऊपर है. And then you have the final pathway, the motor neurons, alpha and gamma motor neurons, right? So spinal motor neuron का function है individual muscle action. So if you stimulate a particular spinal motor neuron, individual muscle fiber में there will be a action, right? But if you want to move a group of neurons, it has to come from higher, थोड़ा सा ऊपर level से signals have to come so that a group of neurons can be triggered and group of muscles can be brought about. So here in the next level we have reflex or stereotyped movements which we are not consciously doing. This is coming from the second level, right? Third level पे brainstem motor control centers we have postural adjustments and tone adjustments of the body, and highest level discrete muscle action, सोच के जो हम कर रहे हैं, and which is initiated and executed consciously. This is known as the, so this particular picture that you see, it is called as the motor hierarchy. Motor cortex, cortical area, brainstem, spinal cord में pattern generator and interneuron, and then the spinal motor neuron. Again the same picture, but here I have added this part. You see cortical center, when I say I am including both the planning areas, right? Planning is actually so there is again a small typing error. Planning and primary motor cortex is concerned with execution. Association cortex is concerned with thought and plan. There are some other areas like the premotor and the supplementary motor areas which along with the basal ganglia and cerebellum, all of these 3-4 structures take part in planning. So thought के लिए कौन सा area है? Idea और thought comes from the association areas, right? Then for plan you have the cerebellum, we have the basal ganglia, then we have supplementary motor cortex. These 3 structures for planning. Once the plan is made, it is sent to the primary motor cortex for execution. Correction happens from cerebellum. So goal oriented activity के लिए this is the first level that comes. Complex movements, they are from the brainstem motor control centers. Simple movements from the spinal cord, and reflexes from the spinal motor neurons, right? Now last part that we are going to discuss today is this alpha or gamma motor neuron. If we talk of the differences, right? So both of these two neurons, they make up the motor neuron pool of the spinal cord, right? Ventral horn में दोनों neurons हैं. Alpha neurons are larger and gamma motor neurons are smaller in size. Out of the proportion, if you see, 2/3 of the neurons are in alpha, 1/3 they are gamma. Fibers that they supply is extrafusal fiber and intrafusal fiber. What is that? So look at this picture. Muscle में you have all done dissection. You have all held a muscle. You have all dissected into the muscle. So those muscle fibers which you generally see, these are all extrafusal muscle fibers which take part in a voluntary contraction. Deep within the muscle, every muscle deep within it, at the core of the muscle we have a structure called as a muscle spindle. This is an enlarged view of a muscle spindle. So muscle spindle is actually a sensory receptor which detects what is the stretch of the muscle and what is the tension developed in the particular muscle. This is actually a receptor. But structurally there are some muscle fibers there also. So spindle में जो muscle fibers हैं, they are called as intrafusal fibers. And spindle के बाहर जितने भी muscle fibers, these are extrafusal fibers. So those fibers within the spindle are supplied by gamma motor neuron, and outside the spindle they are supplied by extrafusal fibers or the alpha motor neurons. Remember, because spindle is a sensory receptor, they will also have some sensory fibers. We will talk about this in the next class. Muscle contraction जो बनता है वो कैसे बनता है, right? And what is the final output? So alpha motor neuron, the commands are generated from the cerebral cortex and the descending tracts, right? Gamma motor neuron के लिए gamma motor neuron activation happens by inputs, descending inputs from the brainstem nuclei and the cerebellum. This is one. They are also part of a local spinal reflex from the muscle spindle. So spinal cord में जो local reflex, stretch reflex, so that is also causing activity of the gamma motor neurons. Gamma motor neurons are activated by both the spinal as well as the upper motor neurons. Okay. Strength of the muscle, contraction produced, it is stronger in alpha motor neurons and weaker in the gamma motor neurons. Why is it weaker? Because contractile fibers उसमें है ही नहीं, it is very less. Most bulk of the muscle is extrafusal fiber, so it is obvious alpha motor neuron activity में the contractions will be stronger compared to the gamma motor neuron activity. And the last function, alpha motor neurons are concerned with voluntary muscle function, and this one gamma motor neurons are concerned with muscle tone and muscle length, right? So we'll stop here today.